Good morning, everyone. I hope we're all well. Okay, great. This panel is our second panel, and I'm delighted to welcome our excellent speakers. This is an important panel because it sits at the center of some of the central conversations that we're having in this conference. It is inclusivity under the AfCFTA. Our panelists are Dean Bridget Baldwin, Luam Dira, and Tolulokwe Odunsi. They're from the Western New England University in the United States. I'll just give us a brief context of the panel. So we've had several scholars commenting on how the AfCFTA will increase trade and development at the macro level and increase consumer product and price choice at the micro level. History and research tell us that trade agreements in general, but particularly those focused on neoliberal marketization, have different, often unequal impacts on minorities. Nevertheless, the AfCFTA embraces neoliberal marketization as a development theory for alleviating poverty and inequality in the continent. As a result, the AfCFTA encourages African states to create a liberalized market, enhance competitiveness, and promote industrial policies. Interestingly, however, these broad objectives have moved from traditional neoclassic trade agreements where states are encouraged to promote export-oriented and domestic industrial policies. The question would be how the AfCFTA aims to materialize inclusivity in all of its senses. I'll just stop there and I'll allow our excellent presenters to give us the full brief on this.
Good morning. You know, with professors, we like call and response. Good morning. Or Jumbo. Is it Jumbo? Is that it? Mambo. Right? Help me. I'm learning. My name is Dr. Bridget Baldwin, and I am pleased to speak at this panel for the AfIELN conference. And the title of my paper is, I think I need that, is Championing Inclusivity, Exploring the Identity and Global Dynamics Post AfCFTA. I am actually here to set the foundation for our panel's presentation. You will notice that there's two of us, but esteemed Madam President named three people, and so you will see me reappear, incarnate as my colleague who is absent due to an emergency. So let me start by laying the foundation for our panel and talking to you about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which are terms used in the context of employment, organizations, and society to explain policies and initiatives aimed at creating a more diverse, unbiased, and inclusive environment. DEI is a useful term that can be applied and adopted internationally across cultures and organizations. And while the terminology and specific strategies may vary depending on context, respecting diversity, promoting equity, and encouraging inclusion are universal concepts that can benefit any country or region. Specifically, in today's interrelated global economy, inclusivity has become a crucial aspect in making major decisions within the international and trade world. So DEI as a concept is very important, and my specific talk is going to be more about inclusivity, but I think it is important to lay the foundation by explaining um, DEI and what it actually means. So the term diversity for DEI, or we call D, refers not to the existence or presence of difference among groups of people, but also the acceptance of these individuals and their differences. It's the ability to combine groups of people with different social markers or characteristics together in an environment. And those social markers can include the ones that you're used to. They can include race, gender, ethnicity, nationality. They can also include ethical viewpoints, religious and political beliefs. So it's gathering these individuals together and incorporating diversity in the environment that recognizes that everyone who has different social markers or social characterizations have unique sets of skills and experiences that can contribute to the value and success of the overall group dynamics or the group goals. E in DEI represents equity. Now, many people confuse or link equity with equality, but these are very different terms. Equity considers the distinctive needs or characteristics or circumstances or the unique identity of individuals, and then based on that information, recommends what benefits or advantages this particular group or individual might need. An equitable practice will consider policies and construct preemptive measures to put things in place that provide support and resources for all based upon that unique goal. So at this point, it might be important to explain how equity is different than equality. Equality focuses on treating everyone the same, regardless of the individual's needs or circumstances. And it's also based on a system of fairness. Equity is based on a system of fairness. But when we consider what is fair when it comes to equality, what that means is that everyone gets the same thing. So as we sit here today, say Madam President TT decides, I'm going to give everybody some shoes. I'm going to give everybody some shoes. I'm going to give everyone a blue shoe, a size 7 shoe, and an Adidas shoe. That's what Madam President decides. And so Luam says, well, I wear size 10. And James says, I wear size 11. And Harrison says, I wear size 6. But Madam President has decided under an equality analysis, everyone gets the same thing. So you can see how equality then is not really equal. Because only those who wear a size 7 will actually benefit from Madam President's decision to give out a size 7. What equity would require, while maybe brand, Adidas, and color might not make a difference, what equity would suggest is that, oh, wait a minute, I got to give Luam her 10, I got to give James his 11, I got to give Harrison. And so we're all getting different things, which might suggest that it's unequal, but in fact, really will be equal. So, as you can see, like I said, equality doesn't always work. We have to assess the needs of an individual and take those needs into consideration and then modify treatment and resources or opportunities to that so that the result will actually be equal. So now I'm going to actually move over, and I've only been given 10 minutes, so I'm giving you a very short version of the things that I do. But I'm going to move into talking about inclusion, which is the focal point of our presentation for the panel. So inclusion refers to creating a sustainable environment where all individuals are empowered to contribute their unique perspectives. Inclusive environments provide not only equal access, but they also provide opportunities, benefits, resources for traditionally excluded or underserved groups. The goal of inclusion is to create a sense of belonging, respect, and acceptance, regardless of background, identities, or beliefs. In the US, the concept of inclusivity actually came out of these three movements in America, or in the US, not so much in South America. And so it's the civil rights movement, the wave of feminist movement, and the disability rights movement. So as you might know, the civil rights movement played a significant role in granting racial justice to African Americans and other marginalized groups in the U.S. And the pivotal legislation that came out of the civil rights movement was the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The feminist movement in its multiple waves led to significant rights for women in America. Most importantly was it gave women the 19th Amendment, which was the right to vote, and also allowed them to participate actively in the political process. So prior to that, women could not participate politically. And then lastly, the disability rights movement increased awareness of discrimination against individuals with disabilities and shaped their inclusion in all aspects of society. Mostly with the disability rights movement, it involved physical disability. We've now evolved to have include neurodivergencies and other unseen disabilities under the disability rights movement. But the most prominent law in the U.S. that particularly helped individuals with disabilities was the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. So, in today's global world, we must recognize that social markers and identities have transformed. So, we've moved simply beyond what we recognize as women and what we recognize as in a concept in the US as race and gender. We've moved beyond that. And so, the concept of inclusion also has to move beyond that. The understanding of race and gender and identity politics is not just a monolithic identity structure, it actually is interrelated. And we are marginalized based upon the relationship between multiple identities. And this is called intersectionality, which was first coined by US legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. And what she posited is that we all suffer from certain inequalities based on social markers such as race or color or gender or religion. But these identity markers intersect in a way or combine to produce experiences of oppression or privilege that is unique based on the intersection of the markers. So, an individual I can be excluded based upon in the U.S. Of course, we consider race. So I can be excluded based on race, right? We call that racism. Or I can be excluded based on gender. We call that sexism. But what Crenshaw suggests is that there's a different version of oppression because of my gender and my race as combined. So I can be oppressed because I'm a black woman, misogynoir, in a way that's different than because I'm a woman or because I'm black. And while it's true that the construction of social identities such as race may not be the same outside of the US, it is important to emphasize that demarginalization is a global experience. In a global community, the non dominant group, such as women, such as blacks, such as darker skinned individuals, remain marginalized as compared to the dominant group, men, white people, or lighter skinned individuals. And therefore, inclusivity as a practice becomes even more important and must continue to evolve and address barriers to access the global community. Now, the idea of inclusion recently has become a global fundamental value for many organizations and businesses because of the changing demographics of the workforce in the US and globally. Therefore, organizations need to recognize diversity and to remain competitive and successful. So, by embracing diverse perspectives and experiences and actively including uh, diverse individuals in the decision making process, we can promote gender equality, we can drive positive social change, we can assist with poverty eradication, and develop inclusive and consistent economic growth. Inclusivity also leads to more transparency and accountability, and this will produce outcomes that help build credibility both internally and externally, which will ultimately have long term success. Trade agreements and policies that are developed without considering the diverse needs and viewpoints of different countries and communities can have negative effects on certain stakeholders and lead to significant inequalities in distribution of resources. By example, in many countries, policies or programs which address and eradicate gender inequality or implement investments in agricultural markets, industries, and trade would enhance economic empowerment of women and the farming community. Implementation of inclusive initiatives Also, I can't, say that this is, just all the way up, all the way to the top. It does have some challenges. One of the main challenges for implementing inclusive initiatives is overcoming what we call as unconscious bias and stereotypes that may exist within trade agreements. Unconscious bias is often ingrained in cultural background, socialization, and experiences that impact actions and decisions that an organization might make without really specifically being aware of it. I may assume, I'll give you an example. This was my first time and a wonderful time I've had. It's my first visit to Tanzania, my first visit to Africa in general. And I went to the open museum that you have that displays the types of housing that exist amongst the tribes. And so I sent a picture of one of the houses to, or the lodging to my son who's 16. And he immediately said to me, or texted me back saying, "Is that where you're staying, or are you in a hotel?" Right? And that was his unconscious bias. That's his vision of what he thought, regardless, right or wrong. Of course, I, explained it to him. But that was his vision. And that is how unconscious bias works. We assume something without having a consciousness of it, and that will impact how we make decisions. Right, we'll make decisions not trying to be negative towards the company, but assuming a certain variable because we're accustomed to that, or that's how we grew up. Um, Other challenges might include cultural differences or communication barriers, the diversity of legislation, resistance to DEI initiatives, or lack of resources or implementation. When I say things like that, we have a tendency to lump Africa together as one country when we know it's made up of at least 54 countries and it's a continent, but we seem to think of one vision when we think of Africa, as opposed to, like my colleague who was talking before, he was addressing China and he was addressing the US, but then he was addressing Africa as opposed to individual countries. And I think that also poses a challenge because there might be communication barriers between the different countries. There might be traditional barriers between the countries. Some countries may follow common law or traditional law or different things like that, and those things need to be addressed because this can lead to miscommunication and obstacles in collaborating. Right? There's also a problem with limited resources, not simply underfunding. Right? We think of resources, we think of money, but it's not just money. It might be lack of human resources, time resources, material resources, and those can also impede the development or execution of inclusive policies on a global level. Now, these challenges may result in a higher number of countries who are resistant to embrace inclusive initiatives. But we think that addressing these challenges requires a universal and culturally sensitive approach to inclusive teamwork tailored to the complexity of the region or the country. So let me conclude by saying, and I hope I haven't gone past my time, but knowing me, I probably have. Inclusivity in the global and trade world is necessary in making a key decision. By intentionally inviting a diverse group of individuals, particularly the underserved, in the decision-making process, all countries can benefit from not just a diversity of opinions, but also a range of expertise and skill. Inclusive practices create more equitable and sustainable outcomes. And while there might be a few challenges that I mentioned, the long-standing advantages of these initiatives far outweigh the costs. Diversity, equity, and inclusion policies not only benefit the global community, but also contribute to modernization, originality, and better decision making in today's diverse and global world. I thank you so much for listening to me. That's really for the end, not for right now. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. Um, I I don't have fancy slides, and I don't think I have fancy words, but I will try to follow the example of Dean Baldwin and avoid looking at Madam President when I'm out of time. Okay? So thank you so much, Titi, and all the organizers of this conference for bringing us all together. Coming to AfIELN and Afronomics Law, whether virtually or in person, has always been a source of joy and directionality for my scholarship. So I'm always grateful, and I always go back with so much more than what I share. And that's why I'm here. I want to get feedback, comments. Please share your thoughts and comments either during the Q&A or afterwards. So I'm going to start my presentation with my positionality, but it's not a positionality in the way I've heard it being spoken quite often, but just to say that I'm somewhat of a critic of how Africa and Africans have engaged with the questions of women's equality in our integration schemes. So in my talk today, I'll focus on women's equality. I'm presenting part of my article, so it's just a snapshot, and I'll be happy to talk about it more during Q&A and afterwards as well. The central argument of my presentation today is based on an inquiry of what does the protocol on women and youth signify to the present era? What does it mean for women's equality movement? I contend that the protocol on women and youth should not be a standalone protocol, but rather be the core of the AfCFTA agreement. Mapping gender-sensitive provisions in Africa's sub-regional and continental integration agreements leads one to conclude that it's very poor and at times even contradictory relationship between Africa's continental and sub-regional integration and women's equality movements. And with that, I contend that the FTA must do more than only market liberalization. As it stands, we are measuring its success by looking at trade liberalization markers. And I'm arguing that we should move beyond that and include other forms of measurements that recognize unwaged labor, state power and role in sustaining social oppression and patriarchy. So I like to structure my presentations, and today I want to structure it in terms of African women's emancipation past, present, and future. So I'll start with the past, which I'm temporarily calling the period of emancipatory hierarchy. And this period of emancipatory hierarchy tends to extend beyond the past and actually does exist in the present. I do hope it doesn't continue to the future, but highly likely it might. So the 1960s conception of emancipation as the Organization of African Unity excluded concerns of women and formalized the divorce between decolonization and racial domination on the one hand, and social emancipatory movements on the other. It seems to me this divorce relegated women's emancipation movement to a more gradual post-independence policy or action, and that is supposed to when decolonization has happened and when the apartheid movement came to an end. So I want to start again as my second point, by explaining what I mean by the divorce in the continent's emancipation project very briefly. During the formative years of the OAU, emancipation was understood as decolonization and anti-racial domination movement. It did not include social emancipatory movements. So in my previous work, I have argued that it should be extended to include social emancipatory movements. And one of those movements that I've seen and grew up with, hearing from my mother's ancestors, sisters, is this women's equality movement. So where did this women's equality movement that existed in go, or during the colonization go, I look at the experiences of women in three countries. It's not necessarily mean that this is the experience of every African woman in the continent. I look at the experiences of Eritrean women during the struggle for independence before and after. I look at the experiences of South African women in the anti-apartheid movement and what that meant for them in the post-apartheid period. I look at Margaret Ekpo of Nigeria and her movement, and that what that meant for women's rights movement in Nigeria very briefly as well. In all of them, one thing that I've seen is, including themselves, the women's rights movements, they had contradictory views of how they want to achieve women's rights, women's equality, or they had a self-sacrificial role in relegating women's movement to the post-independence era. So I will just read a quote from this anti-apartheid activist in South Africa who said, "I'm a woman, I'm a worker, and I'm black. Therefore, I must fight my freedom on three fronts. I believe we must fight the greater evil, apartheid, first." And then I've found quotes similarly in the Eritrean independence movement. Let's fight for our independence first, but some things will survive. And some forms of oppression that the women in the movement assumed will survive but will come to an end in the post-independence era is not just about women's equality. They were conscious that class and other minority issues will also continue. But what happened was, in the post-independence era, these women, again I'm generalizing, expressed views that they were left out from positions, decision-making powers. In all three countries, there is a sentiment, including the ANC's vote on the question of affirmative action or representation of women in the constitution-making process, and beyond, you see women being relegated to the side to an extent. And then this moves me to the present and future to an extent. And in the present and future, just looking at a matrix of our existent integration schemes in Africa, some of, for instance, the EAC and COMESA have provisions that advocate for gender equality, right? Or they might have a policy, and SADC has a separate policy on gender equality, right? But in actuality, we have a plethora of instruments, but less on implementation, or no teeth in implementation. So I guess this is my point of frustration. Maybe I'm outraged by the provisions that I see. Okay, what do this mean in actuality for me and women like me? And then I go to the protocol and see concepts like inclusivity there. So does this mean we've given up on equality of women in Africa? I've seen only the draft protocol. I've not seen the final version of the protocol on women and youth. Correct me if I'm wrong. But it has provisions, it advocates for equality and inclusivity at the same time. So with that, I come to the conclusion, the success in my thinking of continental and sub-regional integration agreements is being measured not by emancipatory objectives, but rather by trade liberalization, which is not necessarily leading us to women's equality and other social emancipatory movements. Thank you.
I'm back. Thank you. So, no, I didn't write two papers for the panel. That would be very impressive, I think. My colleague, Tolua Dunsi Nelson, was not able to come. She had a family emergency, and so I offered to present her paper to you all. And so I'll start. The title of her paper is Racism, Ethnic Bias, and Colorism in Africa Impacts on the Economy and Trade. Racism, ethnic bias, and colorism are deeply entrenched. Obviously, that is not me, that is her. Okay. Entrenched in forms of discrimination that have far reaching implications on societal worldwide, including Africa. Racism refers to prejudice or discrimination directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that that race is superior. Colorism, on the other hand, refers to prejudice or discrimination against an individual with darker skin tone. It includes discrimination among people of the same ethnic or racial group. Ethnic bias is the differential treatment of individuals or groups based on their ethnicity, often resulting in unfair advantages or disadvantages in social, economic, and political contexts. So her paper discusses the manifestation of racism, ethnic bias, and colorism in Africa, examines their historical roots, and analyze their economic impact, particularly on trade development. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for addressing systemic inequalities and for fostering inclusive economic growth under the AfCFTA. So let's start with a historical context. The roots of racism and colorism in Africa can be traced back to colonialism, a period marked by European dominance and exploitation. Colonial powers such as Britain, France, and Portugal introduced a rigid racial hierarchy privileging lighter skinned individuals and European descendants. Even after gaining independence, many African nations have struggled to dismantle the racial and ethnic hierarchies established during the colonial rule. Post colonial societies often exhibit continued socioeconomic disparities based on racial and ethnic lines. Institutional racism, embedded in governmental policies and systems, perpetuates socioeconomic disparities by restricting access to essential services and opportunities for marginalized groups. South Africa serves as one example. Despite the end of apartheid, systemic racism continues to affect various aspects of life, including education, healthcare, and the legal system. The education system in South Africa remains deeply unequal, with historically white schools often receiving better funding and resources compared to schools serving predominantly black communities. In the labor market, black South Africans face higher unemployment rates and lower wages compared to their white counterparts. These institutional barriers hinder economic mobility and reinforce socioeconomic equalities. Ethnic bias. Historically, ethnic conflicts in Africa have had a pervasive impact on the economy and trade in the African region. The Rwanda genocide, which occurred in 1994, serves as a harrowing example of ethnic conflict driven by deep seated ethnic bias. The genocide was fueled by long-standing tensions between the Hutu and Tutsi ethnic groups, resulting in the massacre of an estimated 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus. The economic impact of this conflict was devastating, with widespread destruction of infrastructure, loss of human capital, and a significant decline in economic productivity. In Nigeria, ethnic rivalries among the Igbo, Yoruba, and Hausa Fulani groups have historically fueled political instability and economic disruption. The Nigerian Civil War caused significant economic damage, including the destruction of infrastructure, disruption of agricultural production, and loss of life. Contemporary ethnic tensions in Africa continue to influence economic well being and social stability. For instance, the Tigray conflict, which began in November 2020, has had significant humanitarian and economic consequences. The conflict resulted in widespread loss of life, massive displacement of people, and extensive destruction of infrastructure. This has exacerbated food insecurity and limited access to essential services such as healthcare. In addition to the immediate humanitarian crisis, the conflict has severely impaired the regional economy. In addition to the intra ethnic bias, xenophobia also poses a significant threat to regional cooperation and economic growth in Africa. African immigrants to South African African immigrants to South Africa have experienced significant xenophobic violence, particularly those from Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Somalia. Xenophobic violence undermines regional cooperation and stability, creating barriers to inter African trade and collaboration essential for economic growth. Similar xenophobic sentiments have been observed in other African countries, such as Nigeria, where hostility towards immigrants from neighboring countries has led to tensions and violence. These attitudes hinder efforts to promote regional integration and economic cooperation, which are crucial for addressing shared challenges and fostering sustainable developments. Colorism in Africa. Colorism, distinct yet related to racism and ethnic bias, has its origins in colonial rule and the transatlantic slave trade. The preference for lighter skin, perpetuated by colonial authorities and later reinforced by global media and beauty standards, has had a profound impact on African societies. The foundation of colorism is anti Black racism. At the core of anti Black racism is the notion of the white Eurocentric characteristics such as lighter skin, straight hair, and thinner lips are more preferable than Afrocentric characteristics such as darker skin, kinky hair, and fuller lips. As social psychologist Keith Maddox put it, the phenotypic physical characteristics we possess place us in racial categories where white features are deemed to be superior to Black features. Maddox has described the preference for Eurocentric features as racial phenotypicality bias. Colorism is therefore a subtype of racial phenotypicality bias because it describes discrimination based on skin tone. The legacy of colorism continues to influence social dynamics and individual self perception. Colorism affects social relationships. Colorism impacts self esteem and identity, particularly among darker skinned individuals who may face discrimination and internalized bias. One of the most viable or visible impacts of colorism in African society is the widespread practice of skin bleaching. The economic impact of skin bleaching extends beyond individual health costs to broader societal and economic issues. The significant expenditure on skin lightening products indicates a diversion of financial resources that could otherwise be invested in education, healthcare, or business ventures. Moreover, the popularity of skin bleaching perpetuates colorist ideologies, which further entrench socioeconomic disparities based on skin tone. Economic implications. Systemic racism, colorism, and ethnic bias in the labor market significantly contributes to economic disparities across various African countries. Studies have shown that skin tone can influence hiring decisions, promotions, salaries, exacerbating economic inequalities. For instance, a study on South African women found that those with lighter skin had higher earning compared to darker skinned counterparts, highlighting the economic impact of colorism. Ethnic conflicts can lead to economic instability as they often disrupt local economies and deter investments. Entrepreneurship and business ownership among minority groups face significant challenges, including limited access to capital and markets. Minority-owned businesses often struggle to compete due to systemic bias and discriminatory practices. This exclusion hampers, what does that say? 1 minute? Wow, 0 minutes. Thank you very much. Okay, so let me just, she offered some concluding remarks of what the African Union and the AFCFTA could provide, and she thought that there were some advancements in anti-discrimination policies, peer review mechanisms, and implementation and enforcement of anti-discrimination provisions under AFCFTA and the AU. I'm gonna conclude there because I don't want to do a disservice to by giving my own conclusions on what she thought. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dean Baldwin and Luam, for your thought-provoking presentations, and to Tolulokwe Odunsi as well. I think that some questions that just came up to me as I was listening to you were mainly about framing. So I think that you're starting with you, then you're asking questions around, how do we, how are we going to frame, how do we understand, how do we engage with equality, with equity, with inclusivity, how do we unpack the intersectionalities in understanding how we can incorporate inclusivity in the AFCFTA. I think that could be one major contribution that you could make. So I think in the simple way you described it, so just that example, and that was one of the things that the policymakers said yesterday. How do we ensure that we are translating this, this theoretical sort of conceptualization into language that the drafters, the negotiators, the government officials would actually really understand? And what are the specific action points that we could give them to help consider how they could include them into the AFCFTA? So that could be one point. In simple terms, what is inclusivity to you? How do we incorporate those into the AFCFTA protocols? What framing, what layers, how do we do that? That could be, you know.
That's a very, very great question and very complex question to ask in simple terms. Because when we think about, particularly when we think about the continent of Africa, we think that there's a one size fit all for the continent of Africa, and there is not. And so we have to really individualize. That's what inclusivity is about: is individualizing the perspectives of the region and the country. We can speak about the U.S. because we're one country, but we have 54 countries, or and almost 56 coming, right, if the other two countries get their independence, right? We have 54 countries that we have to think about what needs, resources, and access do they need in order to thrive under the AFCFTA. And I think that's the bigger picture. We have to, a lot of times we don't want to do the hard work. We don't want to, take the time to assess what the needs of the individual countries and the people or the regions of that country might be. And I think that is the biggest challenge for the AFCFTA, is to really look at each individual country to see what their needs are, and to find intersections of collaborations where everyone can thrive and benefit from the trade agreement.
Perfect. Luam, I thoroughly enjoyed the way you set out the trajectory of conversations around equality and women's rights. And it also helps in understanding how actually the realities on ground could influence the types of rights and types of movements that will be prioritized. So, for example, when you are dealing with moving from a colonial state to independence, you're actually focusing mainly on that independence movement. But your country could then get, or a country could then get to a stage where they're actually doing other issues. Nigeria, for example, post-independence, we started to have military takeovers. We started to have questions around, silencing of individual rights. So the question then was not really about women's rights. It was a question of how do we return to democracy where we could freely talk, right? And I think that you alluded to that in terms of how in different countries there were stages in the way certain movements and certain women's rights could be voiced. So I think I have a similar comment for you as well. So when you're talking about incorporating equality into, so rather than having a distinct protocol on women and youth, you're saying actually women and youth should be, conversations about women and youth should be the anchor of all of the AFCFTA protocols, right? So, what benchmarks perhaps could you suggest that drafters of, now new annexes, because we are in the year for revisions, right? The AFCFTA protocols are going to be under review, are going to be also unpacked, right, at this stage to get feedback. What practical benchmarks could we perhaps provide or prefer for the FCFTA Secretariat, for stakeholders, for government to assess whether or not women's rights or the types of action points have been incorporated in those protocols? So I think it could serve two purposes. We could have one standalone protocol, we already have that, and then we could also have benchmark standards to determine how the other protocols are doing with relation to women's rights.
Um, Thank you for that comment and question. Um, so, looking at the AFCFTA as it stands, the 2018 agreement, it has a principle on gender equality, and then that principle does not have subsequent, like you're saying, trajectories. How are they going to measure this milestone? So in my work, so I mix practice and theory in my life and my work. And one of the things that I would say is, okay, it's time to revise it. Let's have more voices in the revision process. That's one in its simplest practical sense. And then let's incorporate more provisions that could serve as benchmarks. Okay, free trade agreement, customs union, this could be benchmarks maybe, but they don't necessarily translate to the emancipation movement. So maybe if we can come up some degree of consensus that African countries, not Agenda 2063, not Agenda something, but just have like in the year next year, all African countries will recognize the right of women um, to keep their citizenship if they marry a non-African citizen, right? I was working on the Somali constitution 3 years ago, and there was this huge debate whether a Somali woman can keep her citizenship, and if her kids can get her Somali citizenship if she marries a non-Somali citizen. It's just as simple as that. And one of the reasons I think emancipation should be at the core has to do with the 1960s movement. We are emulating European integration models in most of our current integration schemes. Although in the 60s, our focus was to look at integration as emancipation rather than trade liberalization. But this is where we are now. So we have developed agreements that are that have trade liberalization at the core. So maybe we could take a step back in the revision process, have more voices, and think of women beyond small scale traders. Like the protocol, if you see it, it says like women and youth are the majority small scale traders. Like, okay, are we looking at women as just as that? What about women as moms, women as big deal traders, women as professionals, women as part of the society who have not been recognized in terms of contributing to the economy because they are doing the unwaged labor at home. So I think there are so many layers that we can work into the protocol rather than into the AFCFTA rather than having a standalone protocol. And women are the majority in Africa, so we should not have just a protocol. Thank you.
Great. So we have some voices here as well, so we could get comments. I think diversity, richness would help to contribute to sort of building this project. And I think it's an important one that we need on the continent. So we open the floor up to questions. Okay, so we take Regis, Susie. We take a number of questions. Anybody else? Or comments or feedback? Yeah. Okay, so Regis, Susie, James, and then
Oh yeah.
we'll take it together.
Oh, thank you.
Take the questions together.
Well, this was really extraordinary presentation. I don't know how. I can. This is a topic that has not been around for some time. I mean, we don't discuss these kind of issues in our trade venues or convenings. So my comment will be you might sound off somehow because I'm a trade lawyer and I want to remain in the trade or trade space. So Luam, you are kind of asking to step back and maybe get rid of a trade protocol and maybe instill gender equality and anything related to gender in the EFCFT, anything Africa is doing more broadly. Meanwhile, as you mentioned also, they see the digital or the trade protocol on women actually requires, or at least it's a trade facilitation tool for women that are engaged in the type of business you mentioned. And I believe that when they say this in the gender and women and trade protocol, they are not saying that there are not other women engaged in other trade. They're simply saying probably that there may be barriers that some other women are facing, which they need to be that these are need to be addressed. So I believe that they're taking into account this kind of the issues that you are raising. Maybe they might not be it might not be that to the extent that you're actually advocating for, but at least there's a consideration in the agreement to actually include these women that are engaged in the business, which they may face difficulties having access to financing and also some of these barriers, structural barriers.
Thank you, Luam, and thank you, Dean Baldwin. Always a pleasure to listen to issues that concern women. And Luam, I think my comment is actually similar. And so the first thing is to try and understand, are you saying we should probably the ideology in terms of reframing trade agreements moving forward should be the emancipation ideologies because it seemed to favor or reflect African needs. Is that what it is? But when it comes to the issue of the protocol, I believe that the focus again is okay. Women have been the issues of women in Africa and trade has always been around the challenges they face as small scale traders, informal traders. And so the idea is, well, for the longest of time, we have said this is what affects women in Africa. And so the protocol has just focused on that. Is it possible that that has happened? And if we are thinking that way, it means that we have kind of relegated other issues and focused on, well, we can't actually dismantle all the problems. And women trade within this area. And so let us affirm the need for women who are small scale traders to be given A, B, C, D, E to assist them. And one of it is there's always this, when we talk about women, it's always a comparison between the formal and informal. So let's focus on the informal because this is where women are, well, that is where we have the numbers compared to the formal trade. Is that the reason that the protocol has come into place rather than kind of dismissing the fact that women are also included in maybe, okay, I think my question is perhaps for the longest time women have said when we trade in this context we do not have protections, and so it kind of gives the impression that while we are trading in the formal systems, we are capable within that context. But within the context of informal trade, we do not have protections. And perhaps that is why this protocol is there. And I agree with you in terms of the protocol. it's a draft, even the one the AFCTA has given. So we don't know if it's a draft or if it's real. So it's difficult to comment about that. But these are the things I wanted to hear your thoughts on. Thank you so much.
So thanks for those great papers. So I thought, Dean Baldwin, your paper was in conversation with the last one of your colleague who is not here, in the following sense, that that you could think of a, an alternative to a DI approach to be an anti-subordination approach about thinking about women's rights. And in fact, I know both of you mentioned several African feminists, and I want to add another one to the table who takes this sort of anti-subordination approach, Sylvia Tamale, whose excellent book I recommend, Decolonization and Afrofeminism. It's a 2022 book, and in this book, she takes a deep dive into women's subordination. So it's very different from an alternative movement on the continent, which is based on liberal rights, the Maputo Protocol on Women's Rights. Just sort of consistent with the first panel, I think further contextualizing the discussion on women's rights in light of the many feminist movements on the continent, and in particular the ones that are grounded in, like Sylvia Tamale argues, in Ubuntu, sort of looking at legacies of patriarchy, colonialism, imperialism, very much along the lines that both of you talked about anyway. Luam, I was I think you could go further perhaps by looking at the various provisions in the women's protocol to enhance your argument that women's equality, or whatever the term you want to use, cannot be achieved through free trade. So if you look at most of the provisions of the women's protocol, they're just reinforcing other parts of free trade. So, for example, finance for women and youth in trade, or participation in formal trade activities, or digital trade. All these are just sort of reinforcing sort of the neoliberal model of free trade. And so I think perhaps providing more more details about what you mean by how the protocol is advancing a vision of free trade that will not lead to women's emancipation might be a good idea.
Thank you very much. Uh, before I proceed, may I congratulate all the presenters for the wonderful presentation. I have a very small question. I just want to know, is there any specific provision within the protocol which actually oblige state members to empower women entrepreneurs with small businesses in order to enable them to actually compete fairly in the international market? So I would like to know if there is a specific provision within the protocol. Thank you.
Thanks so much. A very interesting panel, and it's really, this is really a great forum to hear views which are not just simply celebrating the fact that we have a protocol, but also engaging in terms of the defects within the protocol. Professor Gatti asked you, Luam, to look into the protocol, and then I'm going to ask whether you have looked even beyond the protocol and how we get to this protocol, right? What factors and what kind of ideas shaped the negotiations of this protocol? Who were the active players in those negotiations? Because usually we end up with protocols, but we never ask how we get there and who actually actively participated in those negotiations. Now, because depending on who were the main participant in those negotiations, the results shows that as well. And I think in most of these trade negotiations in Africa, what you see is most of them are financed by Western agencies. And that also comes not only in terms of financial grants, but also experts coming and also organizing workshop, informing negotiators in terms of what kind of provisions that. It's not, like Professor James Gatti, leading these workshops and informing negotiations, but usually Western experts coming. And so there is this tendency of sort of embracing the European integration model, not out of a belief that this is the best model, but also because oftentimes this is the model that is presented to the negotiators and often presented as the best model as well. So I'm asking whether you have looked into this. I know I'm shooting my foot as well because I'm going to do more or less the same for trade and environment tomorrow, but I would like to hear what.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it and had been looking forward to it since the conference started. My question is really about the framing of the AFC FTA within an intersectional paradigm, and wondering whether or not that approach itself requires a level of justification first. And this is because intersectionality itself has come under a wave of criticism as an authoritative account of power and subject formation. And that's also from within CRT itself. Most notably, Jennifer C. Nash wrote, after intersectionality, engaging a number of these critiques. Another from Tommy Curry, talking about how intersectionality derives much of its theoretical foundations from subculture of violence theory, the work of criminologists in the 90s who were responsible for pathologizing the central case, The other comment just follows from Professor Gatti, and that is that the same categories of race, ethnic bias, themselves are bound up in the instantiation of gender in colonialism. So, I mean, a work by Oyeronke Oyewumi in Invention of Woman makes this point that arrives on the continent as an organizing principle through colonialism, and if dealing with those kinds of historical foundations might be worth it as well. Thank you.
So, okay. So, to talk about, I'm going to start with the last question because that's probably what I remember now, most recent, and then turn to Luam to give the other question. But I think intersectionality, I think those who critique intersectionality aren't situated in a position of being understanding the oppression that's different. I can speak about U.S., of course, and how oppression, intersectionality just posits that there are unique ways of being oppressed where a combination of your I guess undermined or insignificant social marker exists. So when I go to get a job, right, as a black woman, I'm actually a black, Latino, heterosexual Christian woman, right? So I have a lot of intersections there. When I go to get a job, I am not going to be oppressed in the same way as a black man. A black man is still seen as a man, and his hierarchy is higher than a woman's, right? A black woman in the US is at the lowest level of the hierarchy structure in the economy. We make the less out of everyone except maybe Native Americans, okay? So my oppression is different. So when I seek a regress or redress, am I seeking it as a black person? No, because my oppression is different than the black man. So I can't seek it as a black person. Am I seeking it as a woman? No, I can't seek it as a woman because my oppression is different than a white woman. So what intersectionality shows me is that my oppression as a black woman, misogynoir, right, as a black woman lies deeper than the structural capability of institutionalism or institutionalized racism or institutionalized sexism can provide for me. So there's something unique that we have to consider. So in putting that in the context of the AFCFTA, right, when we're looking at the demands of the entrepreneur Black or African woman, right, we have to look at, well, where does that oppression for the African woman lie? And is that different, right? Because you don't have a racial structure and perhaps you don't have a caste structure. Where does that oppression lie for the African woman and how can we address that? Whether it's formal or informal protocols, how can we address that so that she also thrives, right? I hope I'm addressing your answer. And then you asked another question about colorism and ethnic. What was that question you asked? More so toward Professor Dunzee's paper, but I'll do my best.
With how gender as an organizing principle in Africa actually emerges. And I was just saying that as Prof had pointed to the work of Sylvia Tamali, that the work of Oyeronke Oyewumi also seemed immediately relevant to me. Yeah.
Right. I think any social marker becomes a organizing principle, especially at the point of an oppression. Right. I can only compare that to the wave of feminists in the U.S. Right. We had a wave of feminists, but it was distinctive. It's distinctively different for white women than it was for Black women because the things that white women were advocating for were a little bit different than what Black women were advocating for, right? And so it does become an organizing principle if you are being oppressed, right? Because you want to alleviate that oppression. We had a movement for equal rights amendment that has never passed for women. An equal rights amendment. It's similar to that in many countries in Africa. We had that wave. And so you saw what I said we got out of it. And now, if you're following the politics of America now, you see that a lot of the civil rights for women are now being rolled back, right? We don't have a right to privacy when it comes to our bodies, right? We might not have a right to marry with regard to who we want to marry, things like that. So it does become an organizing principle. Any state of oppression, I believe, becomes an organizing principle. Yeah. Okay, so James, I hope I do service to what you're asking about with regard to inclusivity, with regard to looking at women in general and how can we, was that was your question, looking at women in general, how can we be more inclusive with regards to incorporating them? James, is that, oh, okay, contextualizing our work in response to, okay, go ahead.
So I was suggesting that um, I mean, I think in the U.S. context that there is an alternative way of thinking about women's oppression as opposed to DEI, which is anti-subordination. And I suggested that Sylvia Tamale's work, I think, the work suggested, contextualizes women's oppression far beyond DEI
Yes.
in the context of examining the historical roots of patriarchy and all of that, and that perhaps DI, in my view, on the continent is represented by the women's movements based on the African women's Maputo Protocol on women's rights, and I think that's at least that's my reading of the terrain.
Yeah. DEI is a new concept. I wrote my dissertation on welfare reform in the U.S., particularly in Wisconsin, and I came up with a concept called paternalist essentialism, which says that when we create policies, we look at one thing, a father knows best, and we establish like one type of person when we create these policies for these women. And I think that, yeah, it does go specifically beyond DEI. It goes in every aspect of public policy or social policy that we consider. Can women get jobs? Can women hold political process? Can women make decisions about their body? Can women, it's in every aspect. It certainly goes beyond DEI, but that is what we're embracing now. We're embracing now DEI to consider a multitude of social markers in order to work together and collaborate and consider, I guess, trying to come up with policies that overcome the oppression that women reside in.
Um, Thank you for the questions and comments. I will try to combine my responses. So, Regis and Sylvia, your question and comment, I felt falls into the more or less similar category. And I was wondering if we can rename, if we want to keep the protocol, let's call it what it is, right? It's not a protocol on women and youth, it's a protocol on women and youth in small scale trade, right? Then let's call it that. Why call it a protocol on women? Women, we are beyond small scale traders. And as it stands, it seems to me there is a perception that we are limited to this kind of trade, at least from the side of those who are drafting the protocol. And they have this definition of harassment. I don't know if you've read it. It's so like bizarre to define harassment in that way. We have a lot of legal definitions of harassment in almost every African country in our penal codes. And I don't even know if that correlates what we have on the ground. But that's a side talk, and I'm going to move from that for a moment. And then I'm going to jump to Henok's comment and question. So I had a conversation a while back, and there was this someone was speaking how women are included in the making of the protocol, and they said we are bringing one African woman, a small trader, into this conversation from every country. One. Imagine for Nigeria to get one woman, and Eritrea to get one woman. Like we're a population of about 3.5 million in total globally. I don't think Lagos population is yeah, so let's just put that aside. But even beyond that, for one woman to represent the views of women, even in one village, does not make sense, right? So there is a detachment between this idea just because you have a woman coming and which women are you bringing? Is this a woman that has been elected by the community of women? I don't remember voting. I don't know if you all did. I did not. So that whole question of this participation of women, small scale traders, is like I just scratched my head. I'm like, okay, I'll put it in the footnote, I'll put it in the text. But we have a big question here. And looking at our existing sub-regional integration schemes, you will see that there are provisions, but again, those provisions do not trail to actual implementation. So if we choose not to get rid of this protocol and incorporate gender equality provisions in the AfCFTA itself, then we should call it what it is. And just say like 80 people were invited, they came, or 50 people came, and they said this. But this should not represent me and Susie or anyone else who was not part of that conversation. So donors, I most probably yes, I have not been. I do want to see the details of the negotiations always, but I've not been lucky to get those notes. If you have them, or if anyone has notice of what transpired, I I want to get them, and I'll be happy to buy you beer or coffee after this conference. Um, James, I appreciate your comment. I really love Sylvia Tamale's work. I was introduced to it very recently after I wrote this part of the article. and I'm using her work in another piece that I'm writing on comparative constitutional law and colonialism. Um, and I'm going to take your comment as it is, and the comment, the fact that the AFCFTA protocol on women and youth, the provisions, the specific provisions that they are perpetuating trade liberalization, I totally agree with you, and I will deep digger there. I'm sorry, I forgot your name. And Dokozo, so your comment and question, I'm just going to take them as they are. Um, if just looking at independence movements, yeah, maybe European or American, whatever, Eurocentric conception of gender might have come in the post-colonial period, but I think gender was also an organizing grammar in the pre-colonial period. It depends. Like if you look at different independence movements, there were women's like Margaret Ekpo's association. That was a pre-colonial movement, right? And gender was an organizing grammar there. Um, I might be missing the question fully or the comment. We can have a conversation later about it, maybe. Thank you. Oh, yes, Nora. Sorry, apologies for coming to your question quite late. So, your question, if there is a specific provision on the AFCFTA, I've only found the draft protocol. So I have not seen, I don't know if anyone has seen in this room. So I have not seen the final version of the protocol yet. I have not been able to find it online. Yeah. And Susie is saying no as well. So I guess the efforts, I trust Susie's search engine manipulation skills, yeah, than mine. So I'm not sure, Nora. I don't know if it will be there. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much to this brilliant panel for really engaging deeply with this important topic. I know that we would like to have more conversations, and I know that we've run out of time, and that means we're eating into our break time. But before we do that, I'd like to thank you for coming. I'd like to thank you for proposing this panel and for this very rich, robust conversations that I think are also going to inspire others to dig deeper into this topic. So thank you so much.